For over 30 years, my family treated me like I was nothing, a failure, a burden. But today, everything changed. I just inherited my real father's $3 billion empire. For as long as I can remember, my name has meant disappointment. 29 years of hearing my father joke that I was the family's failure. It always came wrapped in a laugh. The kind people use when they want their cruelty to sound like charm. That night, the snow was falling over Boston in quiet flakes, soft enough to cover the streets outside the Harvard Club where my father's company, Coltrans, was celebrating its 50th anniversary. Inside, the chandeliers glowed like a crown over people who had never worked a single shift in the warehouses that made them rich. My brother Daniel stood near the podium. Perfect smile, perfect suit, the golden son of Charles and Victoria Cole. I was there too, in a borrowed navy jacket that didn't quite fit my shoulders. The kind of suit you rent for other people's weddings, not for your own family's gala. I tried to blend in with the catering staff, though I was the only one not getting paid to be invisible. My mother swept across the room in a dress the color of champagne. She looked younger than 53, thanks to money and maintenance. Every time she caught me in her line of sight, her smile flickered. Just for a second, like she remembered I was something she meant to hide. She whispered to a friend beside her, a woman who glanced at me and smiled politely. That strained social smile people give when they don't know what else to do with pity. When my father took the stage, the crowd hushed like they were in church. Charles Cole had built his reputation on charm and ruthlessness. In equal measure, he raised his glass and spoke about legacy, about Daniel's brilliance at Harvard, about family, about loyalty. Then he said my name, which surprised me. He said it the way people mention bad weather. And of course, he added, we couldn't have built Coltrans without both of our boys, Daniel, our visionary, and Ethan, our reminder that not every seed grows the same way. The laughter rolled through the room. I forced my mouth into something that resembled a smile, while my chest felt like it was caving in. I kept telling myself to breathe. After the speech, people circled my father and Daniel, shaking hands, posing for photos, champagne glasses clinking. I stayed at the edge of the crowd, pretending to be busy with my phone, scrolling through nothing. Then I saw her, a woman in her late 40s, maybe early 50s, elegant in a dark green dress that looked expensive but understated. Her gray hair was pulled back neatly, her posture straight and sure. She moved through the crowd like she didn't belong to it, like she was just passing through. When her eyes met mine, she didn't look away. She walked straight toward me and stopped just close enough for me to smell something faint and floral. Without a word, she slipped a small gold envelope into my hand. Her eyes were calm but serious. You'll want to read that alone, she said quietly, then turned and disappeared into the sea of tuxedos and sequins. I looked down at the envelope. My name was written on it in a sharp, deliberate hand, Ethan Cole. For a moment I thought it might be from a recruiter or some old friend who'd heard about the event, but there was something about the weight of it, the way it felt almost too personal, that made me slide it into my pocket instead. Across the room, Daniel was on stage again. My father handed him a leather folder embossed with gold lettering. The cameras flashed as my father announced that he was officially transferring ownership of Coltrans to Daniel Cole, his firstborn, his pride. The crowd erupted into applause. Daniel looked out over the audience like he was already a CEO, the smile of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. My mother kissed his cheek, dabbing at her lipstick with a napkin. A perfect image for the local paper. I clapped too, softly, feeling the heat rise behind my eyes. For years, I'd worked at the company's warehouse in Quincy, managing night shifts, dealing with shipping delays, busted forklifts, angry dock workers. I'd kept that place running while my brother was learning about global strategy. I knew the business better than anyone, but knowing didn't count for much when your father saw you as a blemish on the family brand. When the applause died down, I stepped outside. The night air bit at my skin, the snow falling thicker now, muffling the city noise. I stood under the awning and watched limousines pull away one by one. I pulled the gold envelope from my pocket. For a second, I hesitated. It was absurd to open something so mysterious on a sidewalk in the middle of a snowstorm. But the curiosity burned stronger than the cold. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded twice. I unfolded it slowly, half expecting a cruel note, some prank from one of Daniel's friends. Instead, I saw a line of handwriting in blue ink. "They don't know who your real father is." The words blurred for a second as if my eyes refused to process them. I read them again, then again. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. I turned the paper over. But that was all there was. No signature. No explanation. Just those 7 words sitting heavy in my palm. Behind me, through the tall windows of the Harvard Club, I could still see my family. Daniel laughing with our father, my mother glowing beside them, the 3 of them framed perfectly beneath the chandelier like a portrait of success. I stepped farther back, out into the falling snow. My breath came in sharp clouds. I stared at the paper again, and felt something shift deep inside me. Something that had been waiting for years. For 29 years I'd been the family's failure. Maybe that night, for the first time, I was finally something else. I folded the note, slid it back into the envelope, and walked toward the empty parking lot where my pickup was waiting. The engine groaned when I turned the key. The kind of familiar protest that somehow felt comforting. I sat there for a long time, the heater blowing cold air, the gold envelope on the passenger seat catching the light from the street lamp. I didn't know who the woman was or what those words meant. But I knew one thing. My life, as I'd known it, had just ended. The snow kept falling. And I stayed there until the windows fogged over, staring at the gold envelope, waiting for the courage to find out what kind of truth it held. I finally slid the envelope open with the edge of my thumbnail and eased out a stack of papers, folded tight, as if someone wanted to make sure the truth would not spill too fast. The first page was heavy stock with a blue watermark that caught the light from the street lamp. At the top there was a lab name, an address in Cambridge, a date from the year 2002, and my own name typed in all caps. Below it was Charles Everett Cole, listed as alleged father. My eyes went straight to the line near the bottom where a box was checked and a percentage sat by itself like a verdict. 0. Probability of paternity 0. I read it once, then again, tracing the numbers with the pad of my finger as if touch could change them. The heater finally coughed warm air and the windshield cleared in a lazy oval. I felt strange and hollow, like someone had pulled the floor out from under me and I was still pretending to stand. I was 13 in 2002. That meant someone had tested me without ever telling me. A lock of hair from a barber shop, a napkin from a birthday party. I pictured my mother's careful hands, my father's cold eyes. I thought about all the dinners where my father used the word failure like a nickname and the room laughed on cue. A tiny part of me had always wondered why I looked nothing like him. That part felt less crazy now. I set the lab report on my thigh and pulled out the next item. A glossy photo with sunburnt edges and a grainy feel like it had lived inside wallets and drawers for years. My mother stood on a strip of Miami sand, in a white sundress. Younger by decades, but unmistakable. Head tilted back the way she does when she knows a camera is on her. Beside her was a man I had never seen, and yet I knew him. Dark eyes set deep. A mouth that rested firm even when it smiled. Shoulders broad like mine. He had one arm around her waist and his other hand lifted as if he had just said something ridiculous and made her laugh. On the back, in looping blue ink, were 4 words and a date. Victoria and Alejandro. Miami Beach. 1996. My mouth went dry. I pressed my thumb to the ink as if I could feel the hand that wrote it. The third document was legal. I recognized the shape of it before I could read the words. A stamped seal from Miami-Dade County. Case numbers along the top, the name Alejandro Castillo in bold, and a line beneath it that said, Estate. I read slowly, conscious of every breath. Alejandro Castillo, chairman of Castillo Global Logistics, having executed a living trust, directs that all residuary assets and controlling interest in affiliated companies be transferred to his biological son, identified by attached documentation, named herein as Ethan Alejandro Castillo. Estimated consolidated valuation $3 billion. There were words about trustees and successors, about notarized affidavits and a list of property I barely understood. Marina writes, Port access agreements. A fleet registry. It felt like reading a foreign language that I could somehow understand in my bones. I set everything on the passenger seat and just looked at it. The lab report. The beach photo. The court filing with my name threaded through it like a red string. A life taking shape that did not include the man who had called me by the wrong name my whole life. Something pure and ugly washed through me at the same time. I was angry at my mother and also unbearably sad for the younger version of her smiling on that beach. I was angry at my father and also numb with the thought that I had never really had one. My phone lit up and skittered against the console. Mom on the screen. Then again. Then Daniel. The screen filled with missed calls and brief messages I refused to read. I let it ring until the sound made me feel sick, and then I turned the ringer off. The cabin went quiet, except for the fan and the soft tick of the engine. I started the truck and pulled out onto Commonwealth Avenue. The streets were mostly empty. The snow smoothing everything into one soft shape. I did not know where I was going until I saw the sign for the expressway and took it south. When I get lost, I drive to Quincy. The warehouse is where I know how to think. It is loud and it smells like oil and coffee and sweat. And none of those things lie to you. I turned the radio on to fill the silence. A late-night anchor was recapping the day in careful, rounded sentences. The lead story was a building fire in Dorchester. Then a quick segment about a city council vote. I was about to shut it off when I heard the name Castillo. The anchor said Alejandro Castillo had died 3 weeks earlier after a short battle with cancer. She said he had built Castillo Global Logistics into a company with a multi-billion valuation, that he was survived by his sister Lucia, and that the board was expected to announce interim leadership soon. She mentioned Miami, Port Everglades, contracts reaching into Latin America, and then moved on to weather. I gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles stung. 3 weeks. While I was loading trucks and fixing time cards and pretending my father's jokes didn't hurt. The man in the photo had been leaving the world with my name in his last instructions. I felt a pressure rise in my chest. Not grief and not joy. Something big and unnameable that made my eyes prick. I pictured him watching from far away. A man who could see me but not touch my life. By the time I pulled into the warehouse lot, the snow was a thin crust over the asphalt. The building sat like a sleeping ship. Dark except for the yellow safety light over the side door. I parked by the loading dock and killed the engine. The quiet felt clean. I took the envelope inside with me. The papers back in order, as if that would keep my head from spinning. The office smelled like coffee even though no one had brewed a pot in hours. I flicked on the lamp at the front desk and took the chair where Joe usually sits. The plastic cushions sighed under my weight, and something in my shoulders unclenched just being there. I spread the documents across the desk like a map. Lab. Photo. Probate. I did what I always do when a shipment is late, or a route needs rerouting. I traced the lines and looked for the next move. I tried to imagine calling my mother. How would that conversation begin? Hi, Mom. Did you forget to tell me I belong to someone else? I pictured her face tightening. The careful mask sliding into place. She would call it a misunderstanding. She would remind me of everything my last name had purchased. Schools and summers and connections and invitations to rooms like the one I had just escaped. She would never say I was wrong. She would say I was ungrateful for not accepting her rightness. I tried to imagine calling my father. Charles would laugh the way he does when he is about to be cruel. He would say the paper was a fake. He would say anyone can print a seal if they have a good enough printer. He would remind me that I was paid every week because he had made a place for me. He would remind me that Daniel was ready to lead because he had chosen right with him. He would not say my name the way a father says a son's name. He would say it like a problem. I picked up the probate document again and studied the details I had skipped. There was a law firm listed in Coral Gables. There was a contact name. There were dates tied to filings I did not yet understand. There was a clear chain from the man on the beach to the company on the radio, to my own stubborn heart hammering in my chest. I reached for a pen and wrote the contact information on a sticky note like it might disappear if I did not anchor it with ink. The clock on the wall ticked past 2. Outside, a plow rumbled by and the lights stuttered across the room. I remembered a night shift 2 winters ago when the heater in the picking area died, and we dragged in space heaters to keep the crew from freezing while we finished a contract. I remembered Joe telling me that a leader does not need a title to do the job right. I remember thinking I would never have the title and doing the job anyway. I looked down at the bright blue stamp that said my name alongside the word heir, and I did not know whether to laugh or be sick. I thought about Daniel as a child. How he used to sneak cereal into the den and build forts out of couch cushions. I thought about my mother's hand smoothing his hair while my father called him brilliant. I thought about the way Daniel had looked at me at the gala. Like he could not quite see me through the lights. He was not my enemy. He was a man who had been told one story his whole life, the same as me. The difference was, he liked his story. The warehouse hummed softly. The kind of building sound you stop noticing after your first month. I gathered the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and tucked it under my jacket. My hands were steady now. The fear had burned off like fog, and left a strange clarity behind. I locked the front door and walked the length of the loading dock just to hear my boots on the concrete. At the far end, I stopped and leaned my palms on the cold metal of Dock 2. I watched my breath turn white in the air and drift away. I thought about the photo again. The easy way Alejandro held my mother's waist. The way she looked at him. There was a hunger in that look and a kind of peace, too. People make terrible choices to feel seen. I wondered what it had cost her, and what it had cost him. I wondered what it had cost me, and how much of that cost I could still control. When I stepped back outside, the snow had lightened to a fine powder. The eastern edge of the sky held the first thin suggestion of morning. I stood there and listened to the faint ocean smell. The wind sometimes carries up the river when the tide is right. The radio voice from earlier echoed in my head. A company with a multi-billion valuation. A man named Alejandro who was gone. A sister named Lucia who remained. A word I had never attached to myself landing with a weight I could feel all the way to my spine. Air. I unlocked the truck and climbed in. The seat felt less lonely somehow. I placed both hands on the wheel and sat without moving. The map in my mind laid itself out in calm lines. Boston to Miami was a long drive. Flying was faster. Either way, the path was south. I took one last look at the gold envelope on the seat beside me. Then I turned the key, let the engine catch, and watched the warehouse disappear in the rear view as the sky kept brightening by degrees. Morning had the washed-out look of a city that had not slept. I drove straight from the warehouse to my apartment in South Boston, walked through the quiet hallway with salt on my boots, and stood in my kitchen without turning on the lights. The gold envelope sat on the counter where I placed it like a live wire. I filled a duffel with what I could grab without thinking. Work boots. 2 pairs of jeans. Shirts rolled tight. A shaving kit. I took the framed photo off the fridge of our old warehouse crew at a summer cookout and slid it between shirts. I left the suits. None of them ever fit right anyway. My phone buzzed again and again until it felt like a trapped wasp in my pocket. Mom. Then Daniel. Then a number I knew from my father's office. I let it ring until I could not stand the sound and held the power button until the screen went black. The quiet came back slow and deep. I wrote a note on a sticky pad for my landlord that said an emergency had come up and rent would be on time by autopay. Then I took the envelope, the duffel, and the keys, and locked the door behind me. Quincy was waking up when I pulled into the lot. The plows had made a high ridge of gray snow along the chain-link fence. The first shift guys were arriving in hoodies and heavy coats, stamping their feet against the cold as they crossed the lot. Joe was already at the side door with a travel mug in one hand and a clipboard in the other. His beard was white enough now that he looked like winter himself. He looked at me. Then, at the duffel. He did not ask a question right away. He nodded toward the office. Inside. The coffee machine gurgled and clicked like a small engine. I set the duffel by the chair and handed him my badge and the ring of shop keys. He turned them over in his palm like they were heavier than they looked. He asked if I was leaving for good. I said I did not know yet, but I had to get on a plane. He asked if I was in trouble. I said no. It was the opposite kind of problem. He watched me the way only an old line manager can, measuring if a man is running from something or toward it. He told me the floor would not be the same without my boots. He said crews follow the sound of a voice that shows up at 4 in the morning and stays until the job is done. He asked where I was headed. I said Miami. He nodded like he had already guessed and told me to call when I landed. Even if it was just to leave a message. A few of the guys came in early and saw us. Eddie clapped my shoulder. Tyrone grinned and asked if I was finally taking a real vacation. I told them to keep the heaters running in the picking area and watch the west doors when the wind came up. Joe barked at them to stop hovering and get the forklifts checked. They shuffled back out with small smiles and big eyes the way men do when something has shifted and they are not sure if they should stare. I walked the floor one last time. The pallets sat wrapped and ready. The dock lights glowed in their metal cages. A lonely plastic cup sat on a shelf like a forgotten trophy. I ran my palm over the yellow guardrail and tried to memorize the way the paint felt under my skin. This building had kept me sane. It had given me something to lift when I needed weight. Leaving it felt like walking away from a version of myself I understood. I hugged Joe, which neither of us had done before. He smelled like coffee and cold air. He told me to keep my head and keep my hands clean. Then he said what he had said to me 100 times on nights when shipments were late and tempers were high. Plan the work. Work the plan. I smiled because it sounded simple. And maybe it was. By the time I pulled onto the expressway, the sun was trying to push through a low bank of clouds. Traffic was light. I aimed for Logan and drove in silence. Every few miles I caught myself reaching for the dead phone like muscle memory. I made myself stop and breathe. I stuck to the right lane and let other people pass. Parking was easy in the early hour. I took the shuttle and stared out the bus window at the line of planes waiting like steel birds at rest. Inside the terminal, the heat hit my face and made my eyes water. I got in line at the ticket counter and told the agent I needed the next flight to Miami. My voice sounded steady. She typed, and the keys clicked like small hammers. And I handed over a credit card I barely used. She offered a seat near the back and I said anything was fine. At security, I took off my boots and felt the cold of the floor through my socks. A TSA agent moved me along with a patient hand. My duffel looked suspicious for a moment on the screen, and then did not. I pulled my boots back on and tied them tight. A mother with a stroller passed me, her little boy staring at the planes out the window with his mouth open. For a second, I wondered what it would have been like to be a boy who grew up around planes instead of pallets. With a father who pointed to the sky and explained lift. I found a chair near gate B-22 with a view of the runway. The speakers announced an on-time departure in the flat voice that always sounds the same. I pulled the gold envelope out of my jacket again. It had survived the night without tearing, which felt like a small miracle. I slid my fingers in and found one last folded note that I had missed in the dark. It was smaller than the others and smelled faintly of something floral. The handwriting was the same sharp blue as the beach photo. It said that Alejandro had kept track of me since I was small. It said his sister would meet me in Miami if I chose to come, and that I should ask for Lucia at the Castillo Tower. It said the trust papers were real. The lab report was real. And that the truth had waited long enough. It said no one in Boston knew she was the one who had delivered the envelope. It said to be careful because pride makes people reckless. I closed my eyes and let my head fall back against the chair. Lucia. A name to pull me south. A solid shape to aim at. For the first time since I had unfolded the lab report, I felt something close to relief. The path was not just a blur. It had markers. A building with a name. A person to ask for. A door to knock on. A man sat down 2 chairs away. Close enough that I could feel the shift of air. He wore a dark pea coat and a baseball cap with no logo. He held a newspaper that he did not read. I noticed because he kept the same page open too long. He glanced at me in that casual way people use when they are checking a scoreboard. My first thought was that he looked like any other business traveler. My second thought was that his shoes were wrong for a person who flew a lot. Too hard. Too new. He lifted his phone to his mouth and murmured without moving his lips much. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then I reminded myself that paranoia is what keeps people alive in bad neighborhoods and in bad deals. They called for boarding. Families first. Then Group 1. Then 2. I was Group 4. Which meant another 10 minutes to let everyone who mattered more go ahead. The man in the cap got up when Group 2 was called and drifted to the edge of the line without joining it. He stood there, examining the boarding pass in his hand with a concentration that felt theatrical. I stood when they called my group and moved forward with a small tribe of people carrying backpacks and hope. The jet bridge had that metallic hum that always makes my shoulders tense. I handed the flight attendant my pass, and she smiled the practiced smile that can soften any morning. I stepped into the narrow aisle and found my seat by the window near the back. The seat was already warm from the person who had sat there on the last flight. I placed the envelope inside the book pocket and the duffel overhead and buckled in. As we waited, I glanced across the aisle. The man in the cap had taken a seat 4 rows ahead on the opposite side, angled so he could see the whole cabin without looking like he was trying. He had his phone out, but the camera was facing down. He turned it over and the screen reflected the ceiling lights. He set it face down on his knee. He yawned. I told myself I had nothing anyone could steal that was not already taken. Then I rested my forehead against the cold window until the glass warmed under my skin. The engine spun up, a low growl that trembled through the floor and gathered itself. The plane edged back from the gate with that slow patience that always feels like the first step of a long talk. Boston slid by in gray panels and bright runway markers. The wing flexed slightly as we turned. The cabin settled into a chorus of coughs and zippers and the soft rattle of a cart locking into place. I placed my hand on the envelope in the seat pocket, as if it were a compass I needed to touch. The nose turned toward open pavement. The engines rose and held steady. I drew a breath and let it out. The wheels began their smooth roll. Faster, and then faster again. And the ground reached up for one last moment before letting go. The wheels touched down on the Miami runway with a small jolt that pulled me back into my body. The cabin lights flicked on, turning every passenger into a different shade of morning. Heat pressed against the window, heavy and bright. When I stepped off the plane, the air hit like a wall. The smell of salt and jet fuel mixed in the breeze. And for a second, I wondered if my father had smelled this same air every day of his life. At baggage claim, my phone finally caught a signal. The screen lit up with 30 missed calls and a handful of texts that stacked like a confession. I ignored them all. One new message sat from an unknown number. It read simply, "Welcome to Miami. A black town car is waiting outside. Lucia." Outside the terminal, the humidity wrapped around me like a wet blanket. A man in a suit held a sign with my name written in bold marker. He looked like the kind of driver who knew everything without saying much. When I nodded, he opened the back door and handed me a bottle of cold water without a word. The drive into the city was quiet, except for the low hum of traffic. Palms flashed past, their shadows stretching across the road. Downtown Miami rose up like glass catching fire, every surface reflecting sunlight. The driver glanced at me in the mirror once and said softly that Ms. Castillo was expecting me. When the car stopped, I stepped out in front of a tower of mirrored steel that seemed to grow out of the water itself. Castillo Tower shimmered against the sky. 40 or 50 floors of black glass, with the name carved into white stone at the entrance. It looked like the kind of place that could survive a hurricane without flinching. Inside, the air conditioning hit like ice. The marble floors gleamed, and the echo of my boots felt out of place. People moved with a purpose that comes from money and discipline. A woman at the front desk greeted me by name before I said anything. She handed me a visitor's badge already printed and asked me to follow her to the private elevator. The ride up was silent except for the faint hum of cables. My reflection in the mirrored wall looked out of place. The same man who had loaded pallets last week now wore clean jeans and a shirt that still smelled faintly of diesel. The elevator doors opened on the top floor, and for a second I just stood there, unsure whether to breathe or pray. Lucia Castillo stood at the far end of a wide office that looked more like a command center. Floor-to-ceiling windows opened to the ocean, the sunlight spilling across her desk in hard lines. She was taller than I expected, late 40s, maybe early 50s, with hair the color of pewter and eyes sharp enough to cut through the humidity. She wore a white blouse and slacks. No jewelry except a thin gold watch that caught the light each time she moved. "You look like him," she said simply. Her voice was low, the kind that carries even when she does not raise it. I started to speak, but she lifted a hand. "Let me look at you." She took a slow step closer, studying my face like it was a photograph she had been waiting to see in person. Then she nodded once, more to herself than to me. I did not know what to say. The only words that came out were that I was sorry he was gone. She smiled at that, the kind of smile that carries both pride and pain. "Alejandro never liked to be pitied," she said, "but he would have liked that you came." She walked to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of water. "He knew you would come. Eventually. He made sure everything was ready for when you did." She turned to the wall behind her desk, pressed a button, and a screen slid down silently. The city disappeared behind it, replaced by the glow of a digital map filled with dots and lines stretching across the Americas. She touched a remote, and the screen came alive with numbers. "This is Castillo Global Logistics," she said. 49 shipping vessels, 3 private ports, 8 logistics centers, and 12,000 employees. The company your father built from the ground up after leaving Havana with nothing but a loan and an idea. Current valuation, $3 billion. I watched the lines of cargo routes shift across the map. From Miami to Panama, up the East Coast to New York, each one pulsed with movement. A heartbeat of commerce I could almost feel. Lucia glanced over at me. "You worked the floor in Boston?" "Right. Warehouses. Docks. Trucks." I nodded. "Good," she said. "Then you know how this world really turns. Not from boardrooms but from men who sweat. That is why he chose you." The words hit harder than I expected. I stared at the map and tried to picture him. The man in the beach photo. Walking these halls. Lucia watched me a moment longer before clicking off the display. She came closer and handed me a leather-bound folder. Inside was my name embossed in gold and a signature that matched the one from the probate file. "Alejandro Castillo. Your father signed this 1 month before he died," she said. "It makes you successor, trustee, and chief executive officer of Castillo Global Logistics. He wanted you to know what real inheritance looks like. Not cars. Not houses. Control. Responsibility. Legacy." I could barely feel my legs. I told her I did not understand why he never tried to reach me. Lucia exhaled slowly. "Your mother made sure he could not. She had leverage. Friends in the right places. The risk was too high. But he watched. Always. Every report he got from Boston went through me. Your baseball games. Your promotions. Even the times you got written up for arguing with management. He kept a photo of you in his office until the day he went into the hospital." My throat tightened. I asked if she was the one who had met me in Boston. She gave the faintest nod. "It was time," she said. "You deserved to know." She turned toward the windows again, and I followed her gaze. Cargo ships moved slowly across the bay like patient giants. Lucia spoke without looking back. "Your father left instructions for one more thing. He wanted you to see what he built before you decided what to do with it." She pressed another button, and the blinds lifted. The view widened until the horizon split open. Below us, the private port stretched into the water. Cranes towering over stacks of containers painted with the Castillo logo. Trucks rolled in steady lines. Each movement part of a rhythm too precise to be coincidence. I felt small watching it, but also something close to belonging. For the first time in my life, I was standing inside a world that might actually need what I knew. Lucia set the folder on the desk between us. She told me the board would meet tomorrow morning. She said they already knew who I was. The only thing left was whether I wanted the job. I ran a hand through my hair and laughed softly. It sounded strange in that glass room. I told her I had no experience running empires. Just loading trucks. She smiled. "That is why you will do better than most. The men who inherit too easily forget what labor smells like." We stood there a long time without speaking. The hum of the air system filled the silence. Lucia finally said she would have a car take me to the hotel. She wanted me rested before the meeting. She promised to be there beside me when the board convened. As we walked toward the elevator, she paused at the door and looked at me again. "He loved you, Ethan, more than he ever said out loud. He built all this because he could not build a life with you in it. But he never stopped building for you." The words landed in the quiet space between us. I nodded because I could not find anything better to do. The elevator doors closed, and the floor numbers counted down. My reflection in the mirrored wall looked older than it had that morning. Outside, the same car waited at the curb. The heat wrapped around me again. But this time it felt different. The skyline shimmered in the distance. And for the first time in years, I did not feel like running from it. I climbed into the back seat, set the folder on my lap, and let the driver merge into traffic. The ocean flashed to the right, silver and endless. I rested my head against the window and watched the city move past, every street pulling me deeper into the life my father had left waiting. I woke to sunlight spilling across the hotel room like it had been waiting for permission. The city outside sounded alive in a way Boston never did. Gulls calling, horns echoing, the smell of salt pushing through the window sill. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long minute with the leather folder beside me. The embossed letters of my name caught the light. I kept tracing them with my thumb like I needed proof they were real. The meeting was set for 10. Lucia had sent a driver again. The same black sedan waiting in the circular drive. The man nodded as I got in. No questions. No small talk. The kind of silence that feels safe. Castillo Tower rose ahead like a blade of glass cutting into the blue sky. Inside. The elevator ride felt longer this time. My reflection in the mirrored wall wore a dark suit Lucia had arranged to be delivered that morning. It fit better than anything I had owned. When the doors opened, the boardroom stretched out in front of me. Wide glass windows and a table long enough to seat a jury. Men and women in tailored suits sat in small clusters, murmuring into phones or reading papers. Lucia stood near the head of the table. When she saw me, she gave the faintest nod. A seat had been reserved beside her. The chatter stopped as she spoke my name. "Gentlemen and ladies, this is Ethan Castillo," she said, "my brother's son. And as of today, the majority owner and CEO of Castillo Global Logistics." There was a pause. That careful kind of silence people use when they are calculating how to feel. A man at the far end cleared his throat. He looked to be in his 60s. Thin hair slicked back. A watch bright enough to catch the light every time he moved. He said he had worked for Alejandro for 30 years and wanted to know if the new CEO planned to continue the company's direction. I told him I did not plan to change anything until I understood everything. That seemed to relax the room a little. Lucia glanced at me. Pleased. Another board member, a woman with steel gray hair and a calm voice, asked if I had ever run a company before. I smiled and said no. But I had run crews who made sure companies stayed running. That got a few quiet laughs. The kind that breaks tension without admitting respect. The meeting went on for nearly 2 hours. Reports and projections and questions I answered honestly when I could and with silence when I couldn't. By the end, I could feel the weight of every pair of eyes measuring whether I belonged there. When Lucia finally adjourned, she placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "They needed to see you breathe their air." Outside the boardroom, she handed me a phone already set up with the company contacts. "Your next few days will be busy," she said. "But first, I think you should visit your father's office." The private elevator opened on a smaller floor, lined with glass walls and photographs of ships, ports, and crew members. Lucia led me to a door at the end of the corridor. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and something older. Maybe tobacco. The desk was massive and neat. The kind of order only discipline leaves behind. Behind it hung a framed map of the Atlantic shipping routes drawn by hand in blue ink. Lucia said the office had been left untouched since the day Alejandro died. She told me she would give me time alone and stepped out. The door closed softly behind her. I walked around the desk and ran my hand along its surface. There were a few items still there, a fountain pen, a small brass compass, and a picture frame face down. I lifted it. My throat went tight. It was a photo of me at 17, standing on the pitcher's mound at a state championship game. I had never known anyone outside my mother's family had that picture. In the corner, written in neat handwriting, were the words, "My son," strong and steady. I sat down in his chair. It creaked softly under my weight. The skyline stretched beyond the window. Cranes lifting containers from ships far below. For a moment, I could almost feel him there, as if the room itself held the echo of his presence. The phone on the desk buzzed. Lucia's voice came through. "Ethan, you should turn on the television." I found the remote and flipped to a news channel. My mother's face filled the screen. Perfectly composed. Standing in front of the Coal Trans headquarters in Boston, a reporter's voice explained that she and my father, Charles Cole, were seeking legal clarification regarding recent claims about parentage and inheritance. She denied everything. She called the documents false. The result of manipulation by outside interests. My name was mentioned again and again as if I were a rumor. Lucia came back into the room, remote still in her hand. "They will come after you in court," she said quietly. "But the paperwork is solid. The truth is on record." I asked if she thought they would really sue. She looked at me, eyes hard. "Pride and money make a dangerous mix. Ethan, expect the worst. That afternoon, the first notice arrived by email from a Boston law firm representing Charles and Victoria Cole. A petition filed in Miami-Dade probate court challenging the trust, claiming fraud and undue influence. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Lucia called our legal team and told them to prepare a response. She spoke with the calm of someone who had fought bigger wars. When she hung up, she said, "This is part of it. The moment you claim what's yours, someone will try to take it back." I leaned back in the chair and looked at my father's picture on the desk. I told her maybe they would stop once they saw there was nothing left for them to win. Lucia shook her head. "People like your mother don't stop until they have an audience." The days that followed moved fast. News outlets started running headlines. The forgotten son. The billion-dollar heir. Photos from the Harvard Gala appeared beside pictures of the Castillo ships moving through Miami Bay. Every network wanted an interview. I refused them all. I worked in the office instead. Reading reports. Learning routes. Walking the docks at dawn with Lucia. Speaking with the men and women who kept the company alive. They treated me with quiet curiosity. Then with a kind of respect that came from seeing I could listen. Late one evening, while reviewing shipment data, my phone lit up with Daniel's name. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was tight, the way it gets when he is trying not to sound afraid. "Mom is losing it," he said. "Dad is furious. He thinks you tricked them." I asked if he believed that. Daniel paused for a long time. "I don't know what to believe," he said. "All I know is everything's falling apart." He told me reporters were parked outside their gate, that investors were panicking. I could hear my mother in the background, her voice sharp, telling him to hang up. Then the line went dead. I sat there staring at the dark window where my reflection floated over the city lights. Lucia knocked softly and stepped inside. She said we had the first hearing next week. She also said she thought it was time I read the rest of what my father had left. She handed me a sealed envelope, smaller than the others. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper with his handwriting. It said only this: "The truth will hurt them, but it will free you. Remember that strength is not in what you inherit, but in what you choose to protect." I folded the note and placed it back in the envelope. Outside, thunder rolled low over the water. The storm coming off the bay mirrored the one I knew was waiting in court. I stood there a long time, the room dark, except for the city's reflection, knowing the next move would decide everything. The courthouse in downtown Miami looked more like a museum than a place people came to fight. Its marble columns and polished floors reflected every word, every step. Lucia walked beside me in a gray suit, steady and silent, her face carved in the same calm as the ocean before a storm. Our legal team followed close behind, carrying binders that probably weighed more than the truth itself. Inside, the air was cold enough to make my fingers stiff. Reporters waited behind the velvet rope with cameras, whispering my name like a rumor that still hadn't settled. I kept my head down as we passed. Someone shouted a question about my mother. I pretended not to hear. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected. Wooden benches, a long table, and a judge who looked like she had already seen enough of the world to know there were no clean sides. Across the aisle sat my parents and their lawyers. Charles Cole looked thinner than I remembered, his jaw tight, his hands folded too neatly on the table. My mother, Victoria, was a statue of composure in a cream suit, her pearls catching the light every time she turned her head. Daniel sat behind them, eyes flicking between us like he was trying to read both stories at once. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The sound of the gavel cracked through the room like the start of a storm. The case title was read aloud: Cole vs. Castillo Estate. The words hung there, strange and heavy. Their lead attorney, a man with a sharp voice and expensive glasses, began by calling the documents false, claiming the DNA test had been fabricated and that Alejandro Castillo had manipulated a grieving young man for financial gain. He said I had been misled by opportunists looking to seize control of Castillo Global. Lucia's attorney, a calm woman named Ramirez, stood next. She spoke with precision, laying out each document one by one. The court had verified the signatures, the notary, the medical lab. She presented the chain of custody for every test and will. When she played the video, the air in the room changed. On the screen, My father sat in a hospital room, sunlight cutting across his face. His voice was weaker than I expected, but steady. He spoke directly to the camera. To my son, Ethan, you deserve to know that every word is true. I leave you what I built not to punish anyone, but to make something right that was broken before you were born. My mother flinched. Just once. But I saw it. My father shifted in his chair, looking away, the mask slipping for half a second before he caught himself. The judge called a short recess. I stepped outside into the hallway, breathing in the thick air. Daniel followed a minute later. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days. He asked if any of it was real. I told him he had seen the video himself. He rubbed his hands together and said, "Mom swore it was fake, that it was some trick." I told him I used to believe her too. He said quietly that Dad was breaking things at home, that the company was losing contracts. He looked up at me like he wanted me to say, I would fix it. But I couldn't. Not yet. When court resumed, Ramirez requested permission to enter a supplemental record. It was a notarized letter from a private investigator who had worked for Alejandro in the late 90s. The document confirmed that Charles Cole had been medically declared sterile after a racing accident in college. The court went silent. The attorney for my parents stood, shouting objections. The judge overruled him. Ramirez continued, her voice steady, stating that Victoria Cole had knowingly deceived both men, raising 2 children under false parentage for social advantage. She asked that the record show not malice, but intent. My mother's composure cracked for the first time. She turned to my father, whispering something sharp enough to make him flinch. He stood abruptly, demanding to speak, his voice rising. The judge banged the gavel, telling him to sit. He ignored her. He turned toward me, his face red, his eyes hollow. "You think you've won," he said. "You're nothing without my name." I wanted to tell him I never had it to begin with. The judge called for order, her voice cutting through the chaos. She announced that based on the evidence presented, the estate of Alejandro Castillo was valid and binding. The challenge was denied. The trust stood. My name was recognized legally as his heir. The gavel came down, and the sound echoed like the end of something that had lasted too long. My mother lowered her head, her shoulders shaking. My father stared straight ahead, unmoving. Daniel looked down at his hands, whispering something I couldn't hear. Outside, the cameras were waiting again. Questions flew. I walked past them, the flashbulbs burning spots into my eyes. Lucia kept pace beside me, saying nothing until we reached the car. When the door shut, the silence felt thick. She looked at me and said quietly, "It's done." But the way she said it told me it wasn't over. Back at Castillo Tower, the sky had turned dark, thunder rolling over the bay. Rain streaked the glass as we stood in the boardroom, watching lightning flicker over the cranes. Lucia said this would not be the last attack. She said people like the Coles survive on control, and when they lose it, they look for fire to burn what's left. I asked if we should prepare for more legal battles. She nodded. Maybe. Or worse. The rain beat harder against the glass, for the first time since I'd arrived. Miami felt like it was holding its breath. Lucia turned from the window. She said Alejandro had planned for everything, even this. There were clauses in our contracts that could end Cole Trans overnight if they ever broke faith with Castillo Global. I looked at her, unsure if she meant to use them. She said we wouldn't decide that tonight. She said the next move would depend on whether the Coles wanted a war or a way out. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood by the window of my hotel room, watching the storm move across the water, lightning turning the sky silver. I kept hearing my father's voice from the video, calm and certain. "Make something right that was broken before you were born." The phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from an unknown number. It read, "You have no idea what you've started." Then it disappeared before I could reply. I stared at the screen until my reflection faded into the dark glass. Somewhere between the rain and the silence, I knew this wasn't finished. The truth had set me free. But it had also lit a fire, and the people who raised me would not let it burn alone. The next morning, Miami woke up in heat and haze. The storm had passed, but the sky still carried the gray bruise it left behind. I stood on the balcony of the hotel, a cup of coffee cooling in my hand, watching the city crawl back to life. Cars moved in thin streams along Biscayne Boulevard. Horns echoing. The scent of ocean salt carried through the air. I hadn't slept more than an hour. My phone kept lighting up with messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Reporters. Lawyers. Maybe even the Coles. I stopped checking them. At 9 sharp. Lucia called. Her voice was calm. But something in it had hardened. "There's someone downstairs you should meet," she said. "Don't bring anything but your ID." When I stepped into the car, the driver didn't ask questions. We moved through the traffic toward the Castillo docks, where the smell of diesel and seawater replaced the polished air of downtown. Lucia waited near a row of offices facing the port, a breeze pulling strands of her gray hair across her face. She didn't waste time. "The Coles are drowning," she said. "Their contracts are collapsing. Investors are pulling out." She handed me a folder. Inside were reports showing Coltrans had already lost half its shipping volume in a week. I flipped through the pages, recognizing names of companies that had moved cargo through their network for years. All of them were now routing through Castillo. Lucia watched me read. "Your father built these partnerships, and he built them with a fail-safe. Each contract includes a clause allowing termination if the company is managed by someone who is not a biological member of the Cole family. That means Daniel's position is technically void." I looked up. "So if we end those contracts, they go under completely?" She nodded. 3 months. Maybe less. I set the folder down. "I don't want to destroy them." "Lucia." She raised an eyebrow. "They tried to destroy you." I said I wasn't interested in revenge. She smiled faintly, like she'd heard that before. "Then what do you want?" "Ethan." I didn't have an answer right away. I looked out at the port. Workers moved between trucks. Cranes lifted containers in slow rhythm. And I thought about the men back in Boston who'd taught me to drive a forklift. About Joe and the night shifts. About people who worked because they had to, not because they had something to prove. I told Lucia I didn't want the Coles ruined. I wanted them to learn. She studied me a long moment, then said softly, "You sound like him." Later that day, I asked Lucia to arrange a meeting with Daniel. She hesitated but agreed. By evening, Daniel's assistant confirmed he'd flown into Miami. He wanted to see me alone. We met at a cafe near the marina, the kind of quiet place where tourists blended with businessmen and no one looked twice at a private conversation. Daniel arrived wearing a navy blazer and sunglasses. But he looked smaller than the brother I remembered. His confidence had cracks now, fine lines running through the surface. He sat down across from me without shaking hands. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said he didn't know where to start. "Start with the truth," I said. He took off his sunglasses. His eyes were tired. "Mom's losing it. Dad's not talking to anyone. The board wants my resignation. Everything's falling apart." I told him the contracts were holding because of us. But they wouldn't forever. He knew it. He asked if I planned to kill the company. I told him I planned to save it. But only if he helped. He gave a dry laugh. "That's generous, coming from the man who just inherited $3 billion. I leaned forward. "I'm offering you something Dad never offered me. A chance to earn it." He looked at me like he didn't understand. I told him I wanted him to come work for Castillo Global. Not in an office. On the floor. 1 year in the warehouses. Starting in Houston. No titles. No shortcuts. No special treatment. Learn what real work looks like. If you last, I'll renew the Coltrans contracts for good. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You want me to be one of your laborers?" I said I wanted him to know what it feels like to build something instead of inheriting it. He shook his head, laughing under his breath. "You think this is justice?" "No." I said, "It's balance." He stood up to leave, but stopped halfway. "You really believe you're different from them, don't you?" I didn't answer. He looked at me for a long second, then said quietly, "I'll do it. If it saves the company, I'll do it. But don't expect gratitude." As he walked away, I wasn't sure if I felt victory or pity. That night, Lucia called again. She'd heard about the meeting. "You gave him a test," she said. "He won't last." "Maybe," I said. "But at least he'll learn why people like us never quit." Over the next few weeks, headlines changed tone. The forgotten son became the reluctant heir. Photos showed me touring Castillo's ports, shaking hands with workers, reviewing dock operations. Someone leaked footage of Daniel in a warehouse uniform, loading pallets with the crew. The internet loved it. Comments poured in about karma and humility, about how the mighty had fallen. But not everyone was laughing. Late one afternoon, Lucia walked into my office holding her phone. "There's been an incident," she said. She handed it to me. On the screen was a photo of a burned-out truck near one of our smaller ports in Tampa. Police suspected arson. Someone had spray-painted failure across the side. I felt something old and raw tighten in my chest. Whoever did this wanted to remind me that some stories don't end clean. Lucia said security was increasing, that the police were investigating. I told her I didn't want fear to run this company. She nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. That evening, I called Daniel. He sounded exhausted. I asked if he knew anything about it. He swore he didn't. He said he was working double shifts, that the guys at the warehouse were starting to respect him, that maybe he was beginning to understand. I told him to be careful, that some people weren't ready to let the past go. He said something that stuck with me. Maybe the past doesn't want to go either. After we hung up, I sat alone in my office, the city lights flickering across the glass. I thought about everything that had led to this point, about my father's letter, about the look on Lucia's face when she said I sounded like him. The hum of the air conditioning filled the silence. I reached into the drawer and pulled out that letter again. The ink faded, but the words still strong. Strength isn't in what you inherit. It's in what you choose to protect. I folded it back carefully and looked out over the dark bay. Ships moved like shadows across the water, steady and unstoppable. Somewhere out there, a man I never met had built all of this. Not to leave me rich, but to make sure I knew the difference between power and worth. And now it was on me to prove that I did. By August, the Miami heat felt like something alive, pressing against the glass walls of Castillo Tower. The news had finally stopped running my face every morning. But the story hadn't disappeared. Every time a Coltrans shipment failed or a warehouse layoff made headlines, they found a way to drag my name back into it. Lucia said that was the price of power. She said empires don't go quiet when they fall. They make noise on the way down. That morning, she walked into my office with a folder under her arm and the kind of look that told me this conversation would not end easy. She set the folder on my desk and waited for me to open it. Inside were reports from our financial division, showing projected losses if we kept the Coltrans contracts active. 200 million in profit. Gone in a year, she said. The shareholders are already calling. They think you're letting emotion run the business. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the graphs. I had known this moment was coming. The board had been patient. But patience only lasts as long as dividends stay fat. If we pull the contracts, Coltrans collapse. I said, that's not business. That's annihilation. Lucia crossed her arms. Annihilation was what they wanted for you. Don't romanticize it. I looked at her. At the woman who had guided me through everything since the moment I stepped off that plane. She wasn't wrong. But I couldn't shake the memory of standing on that Boston dock years ago, watching men punch out after a 12-hour shift just to go home to kids who barely saw them awake. The Coltrans workers weren't villains. They were just trying to survive under people who'd forgotten what work meant. Lucia's voice softened. Alejandro would have wanted justice, not pity. I told her justice and mercy weren't the same thing. But sometimes they walked together. She shook her head and stepped closer to the window, her reflection blending into the skyline. Every great leader has to decide which legacy to protect. Ethan, profit or principle? Your father managed both. But he built this empire from hunger. You're trying to lead it with forgiveness. Be careful. She left the office without another word. I sat there for a long time staring at the folder, hearing her footsteps fade. Then I picked up the phone and called our finance department. I told them we would honor the Coltrans contracts for 1 more year, at full cost. The silence on the other end stretched. Then the manager said quietly, "Understood, sir." That night, the shareholders called for an emergency meeting. I stood in the boardroom facing 10 people who had known my father longer than I'd been alive. They asked if I understood the financial risk. I told them yes. They asked why. I said, because you don't fix a family by burning what's left of it. They didn't like that answer. But Lucia stood behind me, her arms folded, eyes steady. And no one dared say more. When the meeting ended, I stepped outside to the terrace. The air was heavy, filled with thunder that hadn't broken yet. My phone buzzed with a new message. It was a photo of Daniel, standing in the Houston warehouse, covered in sweat, his uniform stained and his hands blistered. Underneath it, he'd typed one line: "I'm still here." I stared at the photo until the sky cracked open with rain. Weeks passed. Daniel called sometimes, short conversations that never lasted more than a few minutes. He told me about the work, about the men who taught him how to fix a conveyor belt or drive a forklift. He told me he'd stopped wearing his watch because it got in the way. One evening, I got a call from Joe, my old supervisor in Boston. He said a rumor was spreading that the Cole family was moving to sell their estate. I didn't ask how he knew. Warehouse men have a way of knowing things before the news does. The next day, a courier delivered a sealed envelope to my office. Inside was a letter written in my mother's handwriting. The same elegant, slanted script I'd seen on Christmas cards, signed with just her name. It said she wanted to meet. No lawyers. No press. No cameras. Just her and me. Lucia warned me against it. She said some people only reach out when they want something. I told her I needed to hear it anyway. We met at a small church near Coconut Grove, a place where the air smelled of wax and lilies. She sat in the last pew, dressed in black, her hair pulled back, her posture still perfect. For a moment, she looked smaller than I remembered. When she saw me, her lips trembled before she spoke. "You've changed," she said. "You look like him." I told her I knew. She sighed. "Everything I did to protect you." I said she'd done it to protect herself. Her eyes flashed. But she didn't deny it. She said Charles had been cruel, that his pride could have destroyed her, that Alejandro's world was dangerous. She said she'd chosen the name Cole to keep me safe. I asked her if safety was worth 29 years of lies. Tears filled her eyes. But her voice stayed steady. "You were never supposed to know." I told her she'd built a life on pretending, and that pretending had finally come due. She reached for my hand. "Ethan, please, don't destroy your brother. Don't ruin what's left of us." I pulled my hand back. "I'm not trying to destroy anyone. I'm trying to make things right." She looked at me. And for the first time, I saw fear. Real fear. Not the kind people hide behind posture and money. Then she said something that chilled me. "Charles won't stop. He's angry. He's talking to people he shouldn't." I asked what she meant, but she just shook her head. When I left the church, the sun was setting. The sky a smear of red over the bay. I called Lucia, told her what my mother had said. Lucia was quiet for a long moment, then said, "If he's desperate, he's dangerous." That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again. A text from Daniel. It said, "Dad's missing. He left the house 2 days ago. Mom's losing her mind. Call me." I stood there in the dark, the glow from the screen lighting the room. I thought about the last words my mother had said. "He's talking to people he shouldn't." I dialed Daniel, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. Outside, lightning flashed far out over the ocean, silent and bright. The room felt too small, the air too thick, somewhere between the thunder and the stillness. I understood what my father had meant when he wrote that legacy comes with responsibility. The Coles had built their world on lies, and now every lie was cracking open. And if Charles Cole was desperate enough, this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about survival. 2 days passed without word from Daniel or my mother. The silence settled like fog, thick and unnerving. Even Lucia seemed uneasy, her usual calm replaced by the quiet rhythm of worry she tried to hide. Every time my phone buzzed, I thought it might be him, but it was always someone else: lawyers, journalists, investors. I ignored them all. On the third morning, Daniel finally called. His voice was ragged, like he hadn't slept. He said their father had shown up at the Houston warehouse the night before, drunk, furious. He'd been shouting about betrayal, about how I'd stolen everything from him. He'd been escorted out by security. And now no one knew where he'd gone. Ethan. Daniel said. He's not right. He's talking about fixing things himself. I asked what that meant. But Daniel's answer was drowned out by static. The call dropped. I tried calling back. But it went straight to voicemail. I drove straight to Castillo Tower. Lucia was already waiting in my office with her phone pressed to her ear. She ended the call when she saw me. The Cole family's attorney just withdrew from representing your father, she said. He threatened them. Something's off. I paced the floor. We need to find him before he does something stupid. Lucia nodded. I already called one of our security contacts in Boston. They're looking. That afternoon felt endless. The Florida heat pressed against the windows. Thunder rolling in the distance. Every time the phone rang, I felt the edge of panic. But it was never the call I wanted. At dusk, Lucia stepped into my office again. They found him, she said. At the docks in Fort Lauderdale. I didn't ask which docks. I just grabbed my keys and went. Traffic was light. The sky had turned the color of lead. And the air smelled of rain and fuel. When I pulled into the industrial lot, I saw police lights flashing against the shipping containers. An officer waved me down. But I kept walking until Lucia caught up and stopped me. Her face was pale. He's alive, she said. But you need to see this for yourself. Charles Cole was sitting on the edge of a shipping crate. His clothes soaked. His hair plastered to his forehead. His eyes were wild, unfocused. 2 officers stood nearby, keeping their distance. He saw me and laughed. A sound that came from somewhere empty. So the king finally shows up, he said. Come to make sure your old man's finished. I stopped a few feet away. I came to stop you from ruining yourself any more than you already have. He stood, swaying slightly. You think you're better than me. You think you earned all this. He gestured around at the ships. The lights. The distant skyline. You didn't earn a damn thing. You're a mistake that got lucky. I felt anger rise. Sharp and hot. But I kept my voice even. You're drunk. Charles. Go home. He stepped closer. Don't call me that. You don't get to say my name. His voice cracked. You were supposed to be my son. I looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time, I saw not the man who'd mocked me at dinner tables but someone hollowed out by pride. His hands trembled. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with years of resentment. You hated me because you saw him in me, I said quietly. Because deep down, you knew. He stared for a moment, then laughed again. Softer this time. Almost a sob. You think you've won, but all you did was build yourself another prison. The same kind your father built. Men like us, we don't escape. We just trade cages. Before I could answer, he stumbled backward. One of the officers moved forward to steady him. But Charles shoved him away. Don't touch me, he shouted. I'm done being handled. The rain started then. A heavy, sudden downpour that turned the concrete slick. He looked at me one last time. His voice barely audible over the thunder. You'll see. This world takes everything back. They led him away gently. The way people guide a man who's already fallen too far. Lucia and I stood under the awning. Watching the flashing lights fade, she said softly, He's lost. Ethan. Some men can't survive the truth. I nodded. But the ache in my chest wouldn't ease. He's still my father, I said. And the words tasted strange. The following week, the headlines returned photos of Charles Cole. Stories about his breakdown. Speculation about the fall of Coltrans. Reporters called it the end of a dynasty. But buried beneath all that noise was something unexpected. An editorial praising Daniel. It said he had taken control of the company's remaining assets, cut his salary, and was working directly with employees to rebuild. When I read that, I felt something shift. Maybe redemption was possible after all. A few days later, Daniel called again. His voice was steadier this time. He's in treatment, he said. They admitted him to a private clinic. Mom's staying with him. How are you? I asked. Tired, he said. And then after a pause, grateful. I didn't understand before. Ethan, you were right. About work. About everything. I used to think success was money and control. It's not. It's showing up. We talked for a long time. Longer than we had since we were kids. Before we hung up, he said, "When this is over, maybe we can both start fresh." That night, I stood on the balcony of my apartment overlooking the bay. The city lights shimmered across the water. Ships moved steadily through the channel, their horns echoing like low thunder. Lucia called to tell me that the board had voted to renew the coal trans contracts indefinitely. "You made the right choice," she said. "You proved them wrong." I told her it didn't feel like winning. She said quietly, "That's how you know it's real." The wind off the ocean picked up, carrying the smell of salt and rain. I thought about the people who had shaped me, the father who built walls of pride, the mother who built lies, the brother who was still learning what truth meant, and the man I never met who somehow saw worth in me before I ever did. The sound of a ship's horn drifted across the bay, long and low. I stood there until it faded into the distance. For the first time in my life, I felt the strange calm of someone who had finally stopped running from the past, from anger, from proving something to people who never would see it. But somewhere deep inside, I also knew this wasn't the end. Because when you inherit an empire built on secrets, peace never lasts forever. It's strange how quiet life can get after chaos. Months passed, and Miami softened again into sunlight and salt. The storms faded. The lawsuits died out. And the noise that once filled every headline disappeared like a tide retreating into itself. I still came into the office early, before the city woke. The tower looked different in the morning light, less like a monument, more like a promise. The workers on the docks had started calling me Mr. E. A small nickname that carried more respect than any title I'd ever been given. I didn't correct them. Daniel kept his word. He finished his year at the Houston warehouse and didn't quit. Not even when the summer heat hit triple digits, or when he broke a finger unloading cargo. When his contract ended, he flew down to Miami. I met him on the pier. He looked stronger, tanner, leaner. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something I hadn't seen in him since we were boys: peace. He smiled and said, "I made it." I handed him a folded envelope with the new contract inside. "You earned this one," I said. He opened it and stared at the letterhead Castillo Global Logistics, Chief Operations Officer. He looked at me in disbelief, then laughed. "You're serious. Dead serious." I said, "You know both sides now, the floor and the boardroom. That's what we need." He shook his head. "You really believe people can change?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. "No. I think people can remember who they were before the lies." When he hugged me, it was awkward, clumsy, but real. Our mother wrote once a month from the small house she'd moved into near Cape Cod. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't offer it, but I wrote back anyway. Not for her sake, but because I needed to know that even broken people could learn. She said my father was still in treatment and had finally stopped drinking. Sometimes he asked about me. I told her to tell him I was fine. Lucia stayed by my side through everything. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the bay, she brought out an old box from the archive room. Inside were files from my father's early years' blueprints, letters, handwritten notes. She handed me one envelope that looked older than the rest. It was addressed simply, "For my son. When he finally understands." Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Ethan, power can build empires, but only purpose keeps them standing. If you ever doubt your worth, look to the men who follow you. They don't follow your money, they follow your meaning. Love. Alejandro." The handwriting trembled in places, but the message didn't. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. That night, I walked the docks alone. The air smelled of rain and metal, the sea shifting in slow rhythm. Workers moved under the floodlights, their shouts carrying over the hum of engines. Every container that lifted, every crane that moved, felt like a heartbeat in the body of something alive and unstoppable. A man in a worn cap nodded to me as I passed. "Evening, boss." I nodded back. "Evening." It was simple, but it felt like the kind of respect you can't buy, only earn. When I reached the end of the pier, I stopped and looked out at the ships. The largest one, The Santiago was setting out for Rio. Its lights glowed in the dark water, steady and sure, somewhere. My father had once stood on a deck just like that, with nothing but risk ahead of him and faith behind. I thought about everything that had brought me here, the years of being the failure, the forgotten son, the humiliation, the lie that built my life. I thought about the family that had thrown me away, and the one that had waited to claim me. People like to talk about revenge as if it's fire, burning bright and clean, but they never mention what comes after the ashes. The quiet. The part where you decide whether you'll rebuild or just keep watching the smoke. I chose to rebuild. And maybe that's what my father meant when he wrote about purpose. Maybe revenge isn't the end, it's just the spark that forces you to start again. As the ship's horn echoed across the water, I took out the letter and read it one last time under the pier light. The paper fluttered in the sea breeze, the ink fading slightly at the edges. Power can build empires, but only purpose keeps them standing. I folded it, pressed it against my chest, and smiled. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running from my name. I was living up to it. I turned back toward the tower, its glass walls glowing gold in the night. Behind me, the ocean stretched endless, waiting, and ahead of me, for the first time, was peace. If you've ever been told you were worthless, remember this. Sometimes the world calls you a failure only because it's afraid of what you'll become when you finally stop believing them.